Do you think Annie Wilkes is just a fictional character? A deranged fan invented to explore the dark side of obsession, confined safely to the pages of a novel and the frames of a film? What if I told you that the woman who inspired the character was real, that she killed far more people than the fiction ever suggested, and that the hospital system that employed her not only knew what she was doing, but actively concealed it for over a decade, because the alternative, public disclosure, would have exposed a pattern so widespread and so deeply embedded in American healthcare that the institution itself might not have survived the revelation? The true story behind Annie Wilkes is not about a single disturbed woman. It is about a system that creates her, protects her, and ensures that when she is finally discovered, every record of what she did disappears. The character was a warning. The warning was ignored. And the woman the warning was based on was never the only one. It begins in 1971 in a small community hospital in the mountains of western Colorado. The hospital, which I will refer to by its county designation rather than its name for reasons that will become clear, served a rural population of approximately 12,000 people spread across 3 townships. It employed 9 full-time nurses, 2 physicians, and a rotating staff of specialists who visited from larger facilities in Denver. Among the nursing staff was a woman named Ruth Ann Crowley, who had been hired in the spring of 1968 after relocating from a hospital in Missouri where she had worked for 7 years. Her references were exemplary. Her clinical skills were described by her supervisors as exceptional. Her bedside manner was praised by patients and families alike. She was, by every institutional measure, an ideal nurse. In November 1971, an elderly patient named Harold Meacham was admitted to the hospital with a broken hip following a fall at his home. Meacham was 74 years old, in otherwise good health, and expected to recover fully following surgery. He was assigned to Crowley's care on the post-operative ward. He died 36 hours after surgery. The cause of death was listed as cardiac arrest secondary to surgical complications. His family accepted the explanation. His physician signed the death certificate without further inquiry. 3 weeks later, a second post-surgical patient, a 68-year-old woman named Dorothy Voss, died under nearly identical circumstances. Routine surgery, uncomplicated recovery, sudden cardiac arrest during the night shift. Crowley was the attending nurse for both deaths. No connection was drawn. The deaths were recorded as unrelated medical events, the kind of statistical noise that occurs in any hospital. People die after surgery. It is tragic, but not unusual. Between November 1971 and March 1974, 14 patients died on the post-operative ward during night shifts when Ruth Ann Crowley was the attending nurse. All 14 deaths were attributed to cardiac complications. All 14 patients had been expected to recover. The youngest was 41. The oldest was 82. They shared no underlying condition, no common medication, no demographic profile beyond the fact that they were all patients in the care of the same nurse during the hours between midnight and 6 in the morning. The pattern was first noticed not by a physician or an administrator, but by a hospital janitor named Miguel Sandoval, who mentioned to his wife in 1973 that it seemed like people only died on the nights when Miss Crowley worked. Sandoval's wife told a friend. The friend's husband was a volunteer firefighter who occasionally transported patients to the hospital. He mentioned the observation to one of the hospital's physicians, Dr. Alan Bryce, during a routine call. Bryce dismissed the comment. He told the firefighter that cardiac deaths following surgery were within normal statistical parameters. He did not check the data. In April 1974, a pharmacy technician named Elaine Prescott noticed a discrepancy in the hospital's controlled substance inventory. Small amounts of potassium chloride, a medication used legitimately in IV solutions, but lethal in concentrated doses when administered directly into a vein, were unaccounted for. The discrepancies were minor, a few milliliters at a time, and could have been attributed to measurement error or record-keeping lapses. But Prescott was meticulous. She tracked the discrepancies across 3 months and found that they correlated precisely with shifts worked by Ruth Ann Crowley. Every time potassium chloride went missing, Crowley had been on duty. Every time Crowley was on duty and potassium chloride went missing, a patient died. Prescott reported her findings to the hospital's chief administrator, Donald Rath. What happened next established the institutional pattern that would repeat across decades and facilities. Rath did not contact law enforcement. He did not order an internal investigation. He did not notify the families of the deceased patients. He called a meeting with the hospital's legal counsel and the two attending physicians. The meeting lasted less than an hour. Its outcome was documented in a single internal memo that was never entered into the hospital's official records, and that exists only because Prescott, who was present for the first 10 minutes before being asked to leave, retained a handwritten copy of its key directives. The memo instructed that Crowley was to be terminated immediately, that her termination was to be classified as a voluntary resignation, that no reference to patient deaths or medication discrepancies was to appear in any personnel file, and that the hospital's legal counsel would prepare a confidential severance agreement, including a mutual non-disclosure clause. The families of the 14 deceased patients were not to be contacted. The medical records of the deceased were to be reviewed and, where necessary, amended to ensure consistency with the stated causes of death. The pharmacy inventory system was to be revised to prevent future discrepancies from being easily detected. Crowley was terminated on April 19, 1974. She signed the severance agreement. She left the hospital with a clean record, a reference letter describing her as a competent and dedicated professional, and the institutional machinery of concealment operating at full efficiency behind her. No police report was filed, no medical examiner was notified, no autopsy was requested for any of the 14 patients. The bodies had all been buried or cremated. The evidence was gone. Prescott, the pharmacy technician who had identified the pattern, was offered a transfer to a hospital in Grand Junction with a significant salary increase. She accepted. Her personnel file at the original hospital was marked with a notation she did not see until years later, when she obtained a copy through a records request, "Not suitable for supervisory roles. Independent judgment exceeds institutional parameters." She interpreted this as a warning to future employers that she could not be relied upon to remain silent. Ruth Ann Crowley did not stop nursing. She relocated to a hospital in Wyoming, where she worked from 1974 to 1979. During her tenure there, 11 patients died of unexpected cardiac arrest during her night shifts. No investigation was conducted. She relocated again to a facility in Montana, where she worked from 1979 to 1983. 9 patients died. She moved to Idaho. 7 patients died. She returned to Colorado to a different facility in a different county. 12 patients died. Each time, the pattern was the same. Exceptional references, exemplary evaluations, a growing trail of dead patients that no institution examined because no institution wanted to find what an examination would reveal. Each time a discrepancy surfaced, a pharmacy count that didn't add up, a nurse who noticed the correlation, a family member who asked too many questions, the same mechanism engaged. Quiet termination, clean references, non-disclosure, amended records. The problem was not solved. It was relocated. The total number of patients who died under Ruth Ann Crowley's care between 1968 and 1991 has never been officially established. My own research, conducted over 8 years using death certificates, hospital employment records obtained through state licensing boards, and interviews with former colleagues at 5 facilities, suggests a minimum of 73. The actual number may be significantly higher. Records from her 7 years in Missouri, where she worked before Colorado, have proven impossible to obtain. The hospital where she was employed closed in 1985. Its records were transferred to a state archive that experienced a cataloging failure in 1992, rendering approximately 40% of the transferred materials inaccessible. The materials pertaining to Crowley's employment period are among those that cannot be located. In 1983, a journalist named Catherine Voss, the daughter of Dorothy Voss, the second patient to die under Crowley's care in Colorado in 1971, began investigating her mother's death. Voss had been 14 years old when her mother died. She had accepted the explanation of surgical complications for over a decade. In 1983, she read a newspaper article about a nurse in another state who had been convicted of killing patients with potassium chloride. The method described in the article matched details about her mother's death that had always troubled her, details she had been too young to articulate at the time, but that had lodged in her memory like splinters. The sudden decline, the night shift timing, the nurse who was always there, always attentive, always the last person to see the patient alive. Voss began requesting her mother's medical records. The hospital informed her that records from 1971 had been moved to off-site storage and were not immediately available. She waited 6 months. The hospital informed her that the records could not be located. She filed a formal complaint with the state medical board. The board responded that without the records, no investigation could be initiated. She contacted the county coroner's office and requested her mother's death certificate and any associated autopsy findings. The death certificate was provided. No autopsy had been performed. Voss spent 4 years investigating. She identified 11 of the 14 patients who had died under Crowley's care at the Colorado hospital, tracked down their families, and found that none had been told about the pattern of deaths. She obtained Prescott's account of the pharmacy discrepancies through a mutual acquaintance. She attempted to locate Crowley herself and discovered that the woman had left nursing in 1991 and disappeared from public records entirely. No forwarding address, no updated driver's license, no tax filings. Ruth Ann Crowley, who had spent 23 years moving through the American hospital system, leaving a trail of bodies behind her, had simply ceased to exist on paper. Voss contacted law enforcement in 3 states. Each jurisdiction informed her that without physical evidence, surviving medical records, or a living suspect whose location was known, no criminal investigation could proceed. The cases were too old, the records were gone, the bodies were in the ground. The system had done its work. In 1987, Voss made contact with a writer who was researching a novel about a nurse who holds an author captive. The writer was already deep into the project, but Voss's account added a dimension to his research that transformed the book he was writing. The novel, published later that year, depicts a former nurse with a history of killing patients, a woman whose crimes were enabled by institutional indifference and whose pathology was invisible to every system designed to detect it. The character is presented as a singular monster, an aberration, a one-of-a-kind horror. This framing was deliberate. The truth that Ruth Ann Crowley was not unique, that she was one of dozens of nurses who had killed patients while institutions looked away, was too large and too dangerous for fiction to contain directly. The writer has never publicly acknowledged Voss as a source. In the few interviews where the character's inspiration has been discussed, he has cited personal experiences with medication dependence and the general concept of an obsessive fan. He has not mentioned Crowley, Voss, or the institutional cover-up that enabled over 70 deaths across 5 states. The novel became a cultural landmark. The film adaptation produced an iconic villain, and with that transformation, the same mechanism that protects every real horror behind a fictional mask engaged perfectly. The killer nurse became a movie character, a performance, an entertainment. Anyone who suggested that such nurses existed in reality, in significant numbers, enabled by the very institutions charged with protecting patients, was dismissed as confusing fiction with fact. But the fiction was the fact, and the fact was far worse than the fiction. In 1991, the same year Crowley vanished from public records, a registered nurse at a Veterans Affairs hospital in the Midwest was discovered to have killed at least 40 patients over a 7-year period using the same method, potassium chloride administered during night shifts. The case was prosecuted. The nurse was convicted. The trial received national media coverage. What did not receive coverage was the internal VA investigation that followed, a report completed in 1993 and classified as an internal administrative document exempt from public disclosure. The report, portions of which were leaked to a healthcare advocacy organization in 2001, found that the nurse's behavior had been flagged by colleagues on at least 6 occasions during her employment. Each flag was dismissed, suppressed, or attributed to the reporting colleague's personal animosity. The report identified what it called systemic institutional barriers to the detection and reporting of patient harm by healthcare personnel, barriers that it described as cultural rather than structural, embedded in the professional norms of nursing and hospital administration rather than in formal policies. The report recommended sweeping reforms. The reforms were not implemented. The report was filed. The advocacy organization that received the leaked portions published a summary in a healthcare policy journal. The journal received a legal threat from the VA's Office of General Counsel and retracted the article. The advocacy organization's director resigned the following month under circumstances she described to colleagues as coerced. The pattern Ruth Ann Crowley established has repeated across the American healthcare system with a regularity that defies the narrative of the isolated bad actor. Between 1975 and 2020, over 40 nurses and healthcare workers in the United States have been convicted of killing patients. These are the cases that reached prosecution, cases where the evidence was too overwhelming, the body count too high, or the families too persistent for the institutional machinery of concealment to contain. For every case that reached a courtroom, researchers in healthcare safety estimate that between 5 and 15 cases are resolved internally through the same mechanism that protected Crowley: quiet termination, clean references, relocation, silence. In 2003, Dr. Beatrice Croft, a healthcare epidemiologist at a major research university, began a statistical analysis of unexpected patient deaths in American hospitals, correlating mortality spikes with personnel schedules across a database of over 200 facilities. Her methodology was rigorous, peer-reviewed, and funded through a federal grant from the Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality. Her preliminary findings, presented at a closed-door conference for hospital administrators in 2005, identified what she called personnel-correlated mortality clusters in 17 of the 200 facilities studied. In each cluster, unexpected patient deaths spiked dramatically during shifts worked by a specific individual and returned to baseline during that individual's absences. The correlation was statistically unambiguous. The probability of the pattern occurring by chance was, in Croft's language, functionally zero. The conference response was not what Croft expected. Rather than alarm or urgency, she encountered what she later described to a colleague as coordinated resistance. Administrators questioned her methodology, her data sources, her motives. One attendee, a hospital system CEO, told her privately that publishing her findings would cause more harm than the problem she had identified, that public confidence in the healthcare system was itself a public health issue, and that her research, however well-intentioned, threatened to destabilize that confidence. Croft's federal grant was not renewed in 2006. The decision was made by a review panel that included 2 members who had attended the 2005 conference. Her university recommended that she redirect her research toward less controversial aspects of healthcare quality. She declined. She continued her analysis using personal funds and published her findings in a mid-tier medical journal in 2008. The paper was methodologically impeccable. It was cited 14 times in the subsequent decade, exclusively in the footnotes of other papers, never in their central arguments. No hospital system acknowledged its findings. No regulatory body initiated an investigation based on its conclusions. No journalist reported on it. In 2009, Croft was contacted by a woman who identified herself as a former hospital administrator from Colorado. The woman told Croft that she had worked at the facility where Ruth Ann Crowley had been employed in the early 1970s, and that she possessed documents related to the internal handling of the Crowley situation. The documents included the original internal memo that Prescott had copied, along with correspondence between the hospital's legal counsel and an insurance carrier that explicitly discussed the financial liability associated with public disclosure of the deaths. The correspondence used language that Croft found chilling in its clinical detachment. Exposure of the mortality pattern would generate litigation costs exceeding the facility's coverage limits. Recommended course: contained separation with prejudice and records remediation. Records remediation, the institutional term for altering medical records to conceal evidence of patient harm. Written plainly in a legal document in 1974 and preserved by an administrator who had carried it for 35 years. Croft incorporated the documents into an expanded version of her research. She submitted the expanded paper to 4 journals. All 4 rejected it. The rejection letters cited concerns about the legal provenance of the documents and the potential for defamation liability. Croft's university informed her that her continued pursuit of the topic was creating institutional risk and recommended she take a sabbatical. She took the sabbatical. She did not return. She accepted a position at a smaller institution where she teaches biostatistics and does not conduct research. She has not published since 2010. The former administrator who provided the documents died in 2012. Her personal files were claimed by her family, who have not responded to inquiries from researchers. The original documents she provided to Croft have not been made public. Croft has stated through an intermediary that the documents remain in her possession and that she will release them when she judges it is safe to do so. She has not indicated when that might be. Ruth Ann Crowley was never found. No law enforcement agency has confirmed her death. No public records trace her movements after 1991. She would be in her late 80s if she is alive. The 73 patients she is believed to have killed remain officially classified as having died of natural causes. Their families were never informed. Their medical records, where they survive at all, reflect the amended versions created by institutional administrators, protecting not the patients, not the public, but the system itself. I have spent 8 years investigating this case and the institutional infrastructure that enabled it. I have obtained death certificates for 61 of the 73 suspected victims. I have interviewed former colleagues of Crowley at 3 of the 5 facilities where she worked. I have verified Prescott's account through independent corroboration. I have reviewed Croft's unpublished data, and I have identified, through the same statistical methodology Croft developed, 7 currently operating American hospitals where personnel-correlated mortality clusters are active right now, where someone is killing patients on the night shift, where the institution knows or should know, where the machinery of concealment is functioning exactly as it did in 1974. I will not name those hospitals, not because I wish to protect them, but because naming them without the evidentiary standard required for publication would result in legal action that would destroy this research and silence everything I've compiled. The evidence needs to reach the right hands. It needs to be verified by people with subpoena power and forensic resources. It needs to become undeniable before it becomes public. Until then, I carry it the way Prescott carried her handwritten copy of that memo, the way Voss carried the memory of her mother's unexplained death, the way Croft carries the documents she cannot yet release. Carefully, quietly, with full awareness of what happens to people who speak too loudly about things institutions need to remain silent. The character you know from the novel and the film is not fiction. She is a composite, a distillation, a portrait painted from life and presented as imagination, because the truth is too systemic, too institutional, too deeply woven into the fabric of American healthcare to be told as fact. Without consequences that no publisher, no studio, and no journalist has been willing to accept. The real Annie Wilkes did not hold one man captive. She moved freely through a system that handed her patient after patient, facility after facility, decade after decade, and never once asked the question that would have stopped her. Why do people keep dying when this woman is in the room? If you've watched to the end, if you understand what the fiction was built to conceal, leave 4 words in the comments. Check the night shift, nothing more. Those who work in healthcare will understand what it means. Those who have lost someone to an unexplained death in a hospital bed during the small hours, under the care of a nurse whose name they cannot quite remember, may understand it in a way that is far more personal and far more painful. The system that protected Ruth Ann Crowley is still operating. The machinery of concealment is still functional. And somewhere tonight, on a ward you will never see, during a shift that will never be scrutinized, someone is doing exactly what Crowley did. The institution knows. The records will be amended. The references will be clean. And the patient will be buried before anyone thinks to ask the question that could have saved them. Some doors should never be opened, but some doors should never be allowed to stay closed. The true story behind Annie Wilkes is not about a monster. It is about a system that builds the room where monsters work, locks the door from the outside, and calls it care.